It's one thing declaring a writ that people may no longer profit from the trading of human beings, it's another thing to enforce that.
Right.
Enter the West African Squadron. The West Africa Squadron was a detachment of the Royal Navy that was given the task of blockading Africa, the continent.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to the From the Bottom FS channel, man. Today we have the British Crusades against slavery. You guys have been requesting this one for about 2 weeks now, so I'm happy to get around to it. Always down to learn something new. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this video. Come on.
Britain's criminally stupid attitudes to race and immigration are beyond parody, by Frankie Boyle. For those who aren't aware, Frankie Boyle is a famous Scottish comedian who is most renowned for being pretty damn offensive. Needless to say, I'm a fan of his.
Right.
And so when Frankie Boyle writes an article for The Guardian of all places, with the subtitle, "The anti-immigration election rhetoric is perverse. We fear the arrival of people we have drawn here with the wealth we stole from them," I can see the misinformation coming a mile away. So Frankie begins the article by waffling in an overly verbose manner, reminiscent of Charlie Brooker, another man who I am a fan of, but has been led astray by misinformation. And it's full of these sort of contradictions that I'm sure sounded good when he was writing them, but when you actually think about it, are rather silly. I mean, here he is pointing out the irony of the leaders being nationalist and warning about the Scottish National Party, after making a crack about how the Scottish discovered penicillin, and taking credit for this for some reason. And for some reason, he seems to mix up the concepts of trade and immigration. But these really aren't very important. I'm not even bothered that he just assumes that an Australian-style point system for immigration will obviously be a racist system that caters exclusively to white people. You know, this is despite the fact that a Cambridge economics professor has warned the sheer scale of immigration has caused problems for the UK's infrastructure, which was largely built in the 70s. But you know what? None of that really bothers me. What really bothers me is Frankie Boyle's attempt to make British people feel ashamed of Britain's involvement in the slave trade. That really gets my goat, because Britain's involvement in the slave trade...
That really gets my goots.
That really gets my goat.
I never heard that
because
before.
Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud accomplishments of British history. And I know what you're thinking. Oh my goodness, slavery is bad. And that's correct. Which is why the British ended it. For everyone. If we just take a cursory look at the subject, you can see how it is not nearly as cut and dried as Frankie makes it out to be. Even the very word slave comes from Slav, because of the sheer number of Slavs taken as slaves by conquering peoples. But Frankie is trying to drum up white guilt, so let's talk about African slavery.
It's interesting to see, like, someone from the UK understand the woke concept. I really thought that was just an American thing. That was, woke, people being woke this and woke that, but I guess UK, they're hip to it too. Let's get back into it.
Trying to drum up white guilt. So let's talk about African slavery. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to start exploring the West African coast, and they did indeed capture African natives to be brought back to Portugal as items of curiosity. Europeans who travelled to Western Africa discovered that Western Africa had civilizations of its own. For example, a Dutch visitor to Benin City wrote in around 1600, "As you enter it, the town appears very great. You go into a great broad street, not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmost Street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand. More than a century earlier, Benin exchanged ambassadors with Portugal. The Portuguese did take a few Africans back to Europe, but they didn't need to set up operations because they discovered that there were already thriving slave trades in Africa. And so they bought slaves from African rulers and traders. The vast majority of slaves taken out of Africa were sold by African rulers traders, and military aristocracy who grew wealthy from the business.
That's kind of one of the biggest misconceptions that they teach us growing up, or one of the things they really don't teach you growing up, which kind of does give you a skewed point of view concerning slavery. At no point in high school or middle school, damn near even maybe a little college, right? That they really tell you about how Africans were enslaving each other before the Western folks even came and did what they did. You know what I mean? So it's interesting. Come on.
Traders and military aristocracy who grew wealthy from the business. Most slaves were acquired through wars or by kidnapping. And before you start thinking that this is excessively barbaric, this was the standard for almost every civilized society all across the world. Damn. For example, in ancient Greece, Strabo tells us that the island of Delos trafficked in 10,000 slaves a day. Damn. Even before the Roman Empire, even when we're coming to the end of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, it's estimated that a third of Italy was made up of slaves. Damn. Slaves made up of people whom the Romans had conquered and taken back to Italy to do hard labour. And so to anyone even slightly educated on this subject, it is absolutely unsurprising to find that, for example, in 1510, the capital of the Empire of Songhai was teeming with slaves. Slave trading in West Africa was common, but it was different to what you expect. It wasn't for commercial purposes, it was to show status and to give the wealthy African elite a comfortable life. And with the appearance of Europeans desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed.
I mean, it makes it kind of sound like everybody had slaves back in those days, man. Everybody was enslaving each other. It's all about who had money and who didn't, the poor and the rich, the top and the bottom. Kind of with the same thing going on today, you know what I mean? And they still got slaves over there and across the waters, man, that are still working for free, working for nothing to this day, man. It's crazy how much, just YouTube videos, just watching the YouTube videos, you learn so much. It's insane. Come on.
Slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. Indeed it did. The character of slavery on the west coast of Africa changed to look a lot more like the character of slavery on the east coast of Africa, because we're going to talk about the Arab slave trade, specifically the circumstance of Swahili-speaking peoples. Unsurprisingly, the Arabs, being far closer to sub-Saharan Africa than the Europeans, had been taking advantage of it for far longer. They were a people with as much commercial nous as anyone else. The ruling class of coastal Swahili society, sultans, government officials and wealthy merchants, used non-Muslim slaves as domestic servants and to work on farms and estates. And they even had plantations, such as the Omani Sultan Said, who became immensely rich when he started up clove plantations in the 1820s with slave labour. Arab Muslims settled along the coast and intermixed with the locals, forming a people and culture known as Swahili, which started in around the 10th century AD. So unsurprisingly, the East Africa slave trade was well established long before Europeans arrived on the scene and was driven by demands for labour by the sultanates of the Middle East.
Damn. But it's like in America, it's like once you start learning about slavery and stuff like that, it's like that makes you look at the white person, you know what I mean, a different, not like your current times, but like it makes you judge somebody's entire race based off of things that happened hundreds of years ago. But if they don't tell you the whole truth, then that can make you have like a tainted view of just white people in general. It's kind of like, but once you realize the truth, once you realize that a lot of other races were doing the same thing, but what we see like over here is kind of like only white people are being criticized for, or only white people are being condemned for, only white people are being, considered quote unquote evil because they partaked in it. But it's like everybody was doing it. Spanish, everybody was doing it. So this idea that white people are like this evil race and this evil people is ridiculous. But the teaching in our school is the reason why we grow up thinking like that, myself included, man. Once I learned about slavery and lynchings and just the history of America, it kind of it does put like a bitter taste in your mouth, like especially with Black Wall Street and stuff like that. But it's not very smart to blame an entire race based off the actions of a few. You know what I mean? You gotta be wiser than that. Take a step back and look at things from a wider scope. But this is interesting. I'm not gonna lie to y'all. Come on.
And was driven by demands for labor by the sultanates of the Middle East. You might be thinking, well, that's interesting. If the Arabs had been in Africa for about 1,000 years, taking sub-Saharan African slaves, why isn't there a very large population of black people in Arabia? And the answer to that is that the Arabs used to castrate them, cock and balls entirely, a practice that was supposed to have ended in 1962,
Man.
when slavery was finally outlawed in places like Saudi Arabia. This, of course, does not mean that the trade has actually stopped. It is still going on today. It's impossible to know exactly how many slaves the Arabs took from sub-Saharan Africa on the east coast, but one historian produced a total of 17 million slaves. I doubt it was that high, but again, we can't know, and it was for over 1,000 years that this was happening. The point is that slavery was ubiquitous. No matter where on earth you travelled, you found slaves. In Europe, in China, in the Middle East, in the New World, in India, in Scandinavia, in Africa. Slavery was as common an institution as animal husbandry. The only thing that separated the Christian nations of Western Europe from anyone else on Earth was the efficiency with which they could transport taken slaves. And it should come as no surprise that this was made possible by advances in technology that the rest of the world simply didn't have.
Damn.
The most common number I could find regarding the total number of slaves taken from Africa by Europeans was 11 million. And that is in about a 400-year time span. Portugal took the most slaves, with over 4.5 million transported to the New World. Then Britain with over 2.5 million. Then Spain and France totaling just under 3 million. And just so no one is under any illusions, the transatlantic slave trade must have been close to hell on earth. Slaves were taken from Africa and packed into conditions so disgraceful and disgusting, it is unsurprising that there was such a high mortality rate for the crossing. As offensive as this is to look at, we have to remember that this is a consequence of dehumanization. The slaves were not people, they were chattel. It will obviously come...
I know in the last video we did, you guys, concerning slavery, we kind of learned that, from the point of capture, from the point of the sale in Africa, literally every trip, on every stop point, every trip, every walk, every voyage, thousands, if not millions of slaves died during that travel, during that route. I think thousands died from the point of capture to getting to the coast. Thousands more died on the boat. Thousands more died on the trade port once they got to the western location. I mean, and it just showed you, just the poor treatment and the poor conditions of how they were treating these people, man. Man, this is crazy. Listen, come on.
Absolutely no surprise that the driving motivation behind slavery was economic. Portuguese merchants traded with Africans from trading posts they set up along the coast. They exchanged items like brass and copper bracelets for such products as pepper, cloth, beads, and slaves, all part of an existing internal African trade. But the transatlantic slave trade really took off when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. The Portuguese initially had a monopoly on the slave trade, but this was broken in the 16th century when England, followed by France and other European nations, entered the trade. Unsurprisingly, this was a massively profitable trade for everyone involved except the slaves. Africa's rulers, traders, and military aristocracy protected their interest in the slave trade. They discouraged Europeans from leaving the coastal areas to venture to the interior of the continent. European trading companies realized the benefit of dealing with African suppliers and not unnecessarily antagonizing them. The companies could not have mustered the resources it would have taken to directly capture the tens of millions of people shipped out of Africa. It was far more sensible and safer to give Africans guns to fight in the many wars that yielded captives for trade. The slave trading network stretched deep into Africa's interior. Slave trading firms were aware of their dependency on African suppliers, and these African suppliers were making insane amounts of money. For example, the King of Benin was making £250,000 a year selling people into slavery in 1750, and his successor said in the 1840s that he would do anything the British wanted him to do, apart from giving up the slave trade. Quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. With an industry so profitable to so many people involved, and so widespread as to be common to almost every nation on earth, why would the British want King Gezo to give up the slave trade?" Well, we need to turn back the clock to 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, when a French-speaking Duke of Viking descent called William the Bastard defeated King Harold Godwinson of England.
And it also sounds like the Westerners here, they gave them guns, they gave them technology to make it easier to win the wars, to get more slaves, to transport back to them. And that was, I mean, looking back at it, they were probably thinking there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. Everybody's doing it. No one's looking down to it. No one's no one's talking bad about it. It is what it is. This is the way of life for us, and it is what it is. Whew, that's crazy.
And the Battle of Hastings, when a French-speaking Duke of Viking descent called William the Bastard defeated King Harold Godwinson of England. William the Bastard was refashioned as William the Conqueror and took the crown of England. And one of the first things he did as King of England was to have the entire country inventoried. This record was known as the Domesday Book, and we still have it. Thanks to this hard work, we know that around 1086, 10% of the recorded population of England were slaves. 20 years earlier, when he had first conquered England, William had enacted a series of laws, one of which prohibited the slave trade out of England. "I prohibit the sale of a man by another outside of the country on pain of a fine paid in full to me." We don't know what William's motivation for making this law was, but given that the punishment for breaking it was a fine, I doubt it was for humanitarian reasons. Whatever his reasons, within a generation of 1086, slavery had almost died out in England, presumably because William the Conqueror had outlawed the trade of slaves. There appears to also have been a trend for lords to endow their slaves to perform their ploughing functions as free ploughmen. While not a wonderful state of affairs, serfdom is better than chattel slavery, and this state of affairs was solidified by the Church at the Synod of Westminster in 1102, where the Church denounced simony, clerical marriages, and slavery. This made England a very unique case. There probably wasn't another country in the world at this time that had outlawed slavery. There were practically no motivations to do so. It was incredibly lucrative, endemic to the point of normalcy, so it wasn't even viewed as immoral. And the chances are William the Conqueror himself made the slave trade in England illegal just so he could make a quick buck. Fast forward 700 years and the international transatlantic slave trade is in full swing. And yet we still do not have slaves in England. And this is where we meet a man named Granville Sharp, a very well-educated, rationalist thinker of the Enlightenment, who became an active campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade. Granville had had previous legal success defending Jonathan Strong from his erstwhile slave master after being brought to England from the colonies, but we're going to look at the subsequent Somerset case. James Somerset was a slave from Virginia in America who had come to England with his master Charles Stuart in 1769 and had run away in October 1771. After evading slave hunters employed by Stuart for 56 days, Somerset had been caught, put onto the slave ship Anne and Mary to be taken to Jamaica and sold. 3 Londoners had applied to Lord Mansfield for a writ of habeas corpus, which had been granted, with Somerset having to appear at a hearing on the 24th of January in 1772. Members of the public responded to the plight by sending money to pay for his lawyers, who in any event gave their services pro bono publico, while Stuart's costs were met by the West Indian planters and merchants. Given his prior legal experience with the Jonathan Strong case, Sharp briefed Somerset's lawyers. The judgment was delivered on the 22nd of June 1772, and it was a clear victory for Somerset, Sharp, and the lawyers who had acted for Somerset. Mansfield acknowledged that English law did not allow slavery, and only a new Act of Parliament could bring it into legality. The verdict established one thing very clearly: a slave becomes free the moment he sets foot on English soil.
Damn.
And this was, according to Lord Mansfield, that the air of England is too pure for any slave to breathe. No matter what reason William the Conqueror outlawed slavery for, by the time this judgment was drawn by Lord Mansfield, it had become a point of principle. This precedent wasn't set for Mansfield's personal interests. This precedent was set to determine right from wrong. Granville Sharp went on to co-found the Society for Effecting...
That's interesting because, like, I wonder... So we don't really know the real reason of why he chose to, you know, make that a law, right, to get rid of slavery or to try to end it. But listen, he must have saw something in it himself that he just knew, and maybe he just knew it wasn't right. You know what I mean? He just knew something was wrong with this, something was unethical. We're not sure if his religion played a part in it, but I'm glad he saw it for what it was, which is some bull jive. Let's get back into it.
Right from wrong. Granville Sharp went on to co-found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade with fellow like-minded Enlightenment thinkers. And after 20 long years of campaigning in Parliament, which I won't detail here, they were successful in their goal of abolishing the international slave trade in 1807. Now, if you know anything about 1807, you'll know that this was during the War of the Fourth Coalition, where Napoleon Bonaparte was savaging great powers all across the European continent. The Napoleonic Wars led to new territorial acquisitions for Britain and helped stuff Parliament with more abolitionists than they had before, which is why the bill providing for the abolition of the slave trade to conquered territories triumphantly passed in both houses. And the following year this was superseded by a stronger measure that outlawed the British Atlantic slave trade altogether. But, given the raging war in Europe, it was rather difficult to enforce due to a paucity of available resources. After 1807, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, having achieved its goals, became the African Institution, whose principal aim was to ensure the new legislation was enforced and that other countries followed Britain's example. Persuading other countries to join Britain outlawing the slave trade proved more difficult. Despite the efforts of the African Institution and those of British ministers, the Congresses of Paris and Vienna in 1814 and 1815 both failed to reach a specific agreement. Given that this was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it's hardly surprising that there was French opposition.
So it sounds like Britain was running the show back in the day. Britain was probably one of the biggest, the biggest dudes on the block from what I'm getting right here. Let's get back into it.
Was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It's hardly surprising.
I was thinking, I'm like, how the heck can one location, one country end the slave trade. I mean, you gotta be a pretty strong, military wise, pretty organized regime to try to tell everybody this ain't happening no more. Let's get back into it.
French opposition. Where diplomacy had failed, the Royal Navy had to succeed. It's one thing declaring a writ that people may no longer profit from the trading of human beings, it's another thing to enforce that.
Right.
Enter the West African Squadron. The West Africa Squadron was a detachment of the Royal Navy that was given the task of blockading Africa, the continent, to make sure that slave traders were not taking slaves to the Americas. Needless to say, in 1807, there was only a token force performing this operation, comprising of 2 ships. This number was increased to 5 ships until the War of 1812 with the United States. But after 1815, with Britain victorious in Europe and supreme at sea, the Royal Navy turned its attention back to the challenge. The institution of slavery was formally abolished in the British Empire in 1833. And by the 1850s, around 25 vessels and 2,000 officers and men were on the station, supported by nearly 1,000 crewmen. Experienced fishermen recruited as sailors.
Look how they spell it though, crewmen. That's crazy.
What is now the coast of modern Liberia. It's worth noting that this was not a pleasant job, and the mortality rate was 5 times higher compared with fleets in the Mediterranean or in home waters. To help incentivize the crew, money was actually given to each crew per slave that they freed. But there was a real zeitgeist in Britain for the abolition of slavery. For example, the pursuit and capture of slave ships became celebrated naval engagements, widely reported back in peacetime Britain. They became a source of national pride, so it's no wonder that many of the crews really did have an evangelical zeal about the anti-slavery patrolling. However, I don't want to give the impression that this was all for humanitarian reasons.
I was gonna say,
there's no doubt that Britain, in her foreign policy, used her anti-slavery laws as a stick with which to beat her opponents, primarily the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who refused to conform to these demands.
that makes sense. All right, that makes more sense. So basically, Britain shut it down because her opposition, other places, other countries, were starting to get too much money, starting to organize too quickly, and then maybe they saw these other places who that they could possibly grow into a threat down the line. So she was like, let's set it all down so we can remain in power, so we can remain on top. There's always something more to it. So I'm glad he went into that right here.
Primarily the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who refused to conform to these demands. Britain demanded Spain, Portugal, and the very new nation of Brazil to declare slave trading to be piracy. And while these nations paid lip service to these principles,
you gonna tell another country you gonna tell them how to write their own rules, and Britain must have been a powerhouse back in the day. They over here bullying people. Come on.
Slave trading to be piracy. And while these nations paid lip service to these principles, they failed to enforce them, which led to a British blockade of Brazil by 1850, which of course forced the nascent Brazilian Empire to capitulate. And it didn't end there. In the 1860s, David Livingstone reports of Arab atrocities against enslaved Africans stirred up the interest of the British public, reviving the flagging abolitionist movement. Throughout the 1870s, the Navy attempted to suppress this abominable eastern trade at Zanzibar in particular. Needless to say, the British Navy continued their mission against the slavers across the Indian Ocean. The abolition of slavery became the British project. It captured the hearts and minds of the entire country, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant.
That's smart though, right? That's genius. So you'll tell the people the reason why you're going against the slave trade is because we're better than that. We're higher than that. And all the good imagery and the good optics, but really you're just doing it to keep your enemies at bay and keep them from maybe one day down the line obtaining power to one day maybe come at you. So smart, strategic. Let's go.
Minds of the entire country, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. This is certainly how the British saw it. For example, This spirit of chivalry, we see it in acts of heroism by land and sea in fights against the slave trade. Alfred Tennyson, the unweary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the History of Nations. William Lecky. All of this was done against the vested financial interests of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire nations were against the idea of abolishing slavery and the slave trade. The very notion was alien to the human existence until Britain made it happen.
Damn.
In the 19th century, if you saw a ship bearing down on you, flying this flag, and you were a slave trader, you knew that this flag stood for liberty. This was the flag of a nation that defied human convention for a point of principle and spent its blood, sweat, tears, and treasure to enforce it on the world. This is the flag of the nation that accepted the absolute moral truth that slavery is wrong. No matter what riches can be amassed, no matter what power can be gained, no matter the cost, slavery had to be abolished. That was the British Crusade. Damn. When Britain held the reins of world power, that is what she did with it. So, Frankie, to be honest with you, when you say, we have streets named after slave owners, we have profited from a vile crime and feel no shame, it is British people that don't learn languages or British history. Britain is the true scrounger, the true criminal. I have to concur. British people apparently do not learn British history because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud moments any nation could have had in their history. I want to make one thing crystal clear, Frankie. You live in a world without slavery because of Britain.
That was tough, bro. That was good. That was good. That was good. Listen, you guys, that was a very good video here. Start off a little slow, but it got very interesting towards the middle, towards the end there. So just to dive into a few things that he's talking about here, a few things that he referenced in the video. Probably a few of you guys knew, a few of you guys didn't know. I had no idea Britain was so involved in the abolishment of slavery to that extent, you know what I mean? Whether the reasoning be for self-gain or the reasoning be to be held in a righteous viewpoint to the world and to the country, it to me doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they made the right decision here, stepping in and shutting it down, and being the only, country that at that time had the balls. Let's call it what it is. Had the balls to, go against it when everybody else is making money off. Everybody else is making thousands of dollars that would equate to millions of dollars, billions of dollars in this day and time, right? So we gotta respect that to a certain extent because they were willing to step into the fire and take the heat, and take the criticism when the iron was hot. Everybody was getting money. Everybody was trading folks. Everybody was in there going back and forth. And they were like, nah, this ain't it. This ain't where we're going to go. And I like how at the end of the video, he says there, that flag, what that flag meant, to other ships when they were at sea and they had slaves on it. That means you about to come out them slaves, but my boy. All right. And that's always a good thing. I didn't know that. Not going to lie to y'all. So, very good video. Shout out to the subscriber who requested this video. I will tag them down below over here. So until next time, you guys, make sure you guys click like, subscribe to this content. Any other videos you want me to check out, you might find interesting, let me know down in the comment section. Until next time, y'all be safe out there. Peace.